Washington District of Columbia, February 1962, 2 in the morning, and John F. Kennedy was walking alone outside the White House gates when he saw a man sleeping on a bench in the freezing cold. That man had fought for this country in Korea and come home to nothing, and what Kennedy did next, he never told a single soul. If you believe the most powerful thing a president ever did happen, not in the Oval Office, but on a frozen park bench at 2 in the morning, subscribe now so these untold stories find you. Washington District of Columbia, February 14, 1962. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees by midnight, and the streets around Lafayette Square were empty except for the wind moving dead leaves across the frozen pavement and the distant sound of a car somewhere on Pennsylvania Avenue that had already turned the corner and was gone before Secret Service agent Thomas Burrell could say a word. The President of the United States had already stopped walking. He was wearing a dark overcoat over his pajamas and a pair of leather shoes he had not bothered to tie because he had not planned on going outside at all. He had been unable to sleep, which was not unusual, and he had walked to the window of the Lincoln bedroom and stood there for 11 minutes looking at the square below, and then, without fully deciding to do it, he had put on his coat and walked down the back corridor and out through the East Garden entrance into the cold. Thomas Burrell was 29 years old and had been assigned to the presidential detail for 7 months, and he had learned in those 7 months that when the president moved without announcement, the correct response was to follow without comment. He followed now at a distance of approximately 30 feet, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air, his hand near, but not on the weapon at his side. The man on the bench was named Raymond Curtis Elwood. He was 51 years old, and he was sleeping on his left side with his knees drawn toward his chest and a piece of cardboard tucked under his body to keep the cold of the wood from coming through. He had a canvas duffel bag under his head, and he was wearing 2 jackets, both of them thin, and neither of them built for February in Washington District of Columbia. He had a beard that had grown out past the point of intention, and his hands were bare, and the knuckles of his right hand were split at 2 places from the cold. Kennedy stood at the edge of the path and looked at the man for a long moment. He looked at the duffel bag, he looked at the bare hands, he looked at the way the man had folded himself inward against the temperature, the way a person folds who has learned that there is no warmth coming from outside, and the only strategy is to preserve what little the body still holds. He had seen men sleep like that before, not in photographs, not in briefing documents. He had seen it in the Pacific in 1943, when men on his boat had gone hours without shelter and had learned to make themselves small against the elements, and he recognized the shape of it now, the way you recognize a language you have not spoken in years, but have not forgotten. He turned to Burrell. Find out if there is a blanket in the guardhouse, he said quietly, and a cup of something hot. If there is anything available at this hour. Burrell looked at him. Sir Easy Thomas, Kennedy said, and his voice was not a presidential voice. It was the voice of a man standing in the cold at 2 in the morning, asking another man for a simple thing. Burrell went. Kennedy sat down on the bench. He left space between himself and the sleeping man. He did not wake him. He sat with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat and looked at Lafayette Square, the frozen fountain, at its center, the dark shapes of the trees, the lights of the buildings beyond. He was 34 days into his 2nd year as President of the United States. He had spent the previous afternoon in a 3-hour meeting about the situation in Southeast Asia, and the previous evening reading a 40-page intelligence summary about Soviet missile activity, and he had gone to bed at 12:30 and lain there, looking at the ceiling of the Lincoln bedroom, and been unable to locate the thing inside himself that allowed sleep to come. Raymond Curtis Elwood woke at 2:17. He woke the way men wake who have spent long periods sleeping in unsafe places all at once, with his eyes open and his body already tensed before his mind had caught up with where he was. He saw the man sitting on the other end of the bench, and he pulled himself upright fast and grabbed the strap of his duffel bag. "Easy," Kennedy said. He held up one hand, palm out the way you hold up a hand to show it is empty. "I am not going to ask you to move." Raymond looked at him. He was still processing the cold and the dark and the unfamiliar face. "This is a public bench," Kennedy said. "You have every right to be here." Raymond sat back slowly. He looked at the man beside him, at the dark overcoat, at the leather shoes. He looked at his face, and something in the back of his mind began assembling pieces, but did not finish the assembly yet. "You got a cigarette?" Raymond said. "I do not." Kennedy said. "I am sorry." Raymond nodded. He pulled the canvas bag onto his lap and held it there. "How long have you been out here?" Kennedy asked. 3 nights. Raymond said. "Before that I was at a place on 6th Street, but they filled up." Kennedy was quiet for a moment. "Where did you serve?" he asked. Raymond looked at him sharply. "How did you know?" "The way you woke up," Kennedy said. "Simply, a man does not wake like that unless he has spent time sleeping in places where waking slow could get him killed." Raymond looked at the fountain for a moment. "Korea," he said. 38th parallel. "What division?" 2nd Infantry. Kennedy nodded slowly. 50 and 51. Raymond looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "How did you?" Kennedy said. "I read the reports," which was true, and was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had read every casualty report from the 2nd Infantry Division campaigns along the 38th parallel in the fall of 1950, and he had read them not as a senator reviewing military records, but as a man who had watched other men die in water and knew what the documents did not capture. Burrell came back at 2:23 with a wool blanket from the guardhouse and a thermos of coffee that the overnight guard had been drinking and had surrendered without being told why. He handed them to Kennedy without a word and stepped back. Kennedy held the blanket out to Raymond. Raymond looked at it. He did not take it immediately the way a man does not take a thing immediately when he has learned that things offered sometimes have conditions attached. "No conditions," Kennedy said. "It is just cold." Raymond took the blanket. He pulled it around his shoulders. He accepted the cup of coffee Kennedy poured from the thermos and held it in both hands, and the split knuckles of his right hand were very visible in the low light from the path lamps. Kennedy looked at them and did not say anything about them. They sat together for 22 minutes. Raymond talked and Kennedy listened the way Kennedy listened when he was genuinely listening, which was without interruption and without the particular quality of attention that is actually just waiting for the other person to finish. Raymond talked about Incheon and about the cold there, which was a different cold than Washington District of Columbia cold. He said it was a cold that had intention behind it. He talked about coming home in March of 1952 to a bus station in Columbus, Ohio, and nobody being there, not because his family did not care, but because nobody had told them the right date. He talked about the job at the sheet metal plant that had lasted 4 years until the plant closed. He talked about his wife Margaret, who had stayed 11 years and left not out of cruelty, he said, but out of exhaustion, and he understood it. He talked about his son Gerald, who was 19 now and living in Detroit, Michigan, and who Raymond had not spoken to in 14 months. Not because they were angry at each other, but because Raymond did not have a phone number that stayed the same long enough to give anyone. Kennedy listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not perform sympathy. He simply sat on a bench in Lafayette Square at 2 in the morning in 19-degree weather and listened to a man who had not had anyone listen to him in a very long time. At 2:41, Raymond finished his coffee and looked at the man beside him in the full way he had been avoiding since he woke up. He looked at the face. He looked at the jaw and the eyes and the particular way the hair was calmed, and the assembly that had been building in the back of his mind since 2:17 finished itself all at once. He sat very still for a moment. "You are," he started. Kennedy Waited, you are the President. Raymond said. His voice came out different than he expected it to. Yes, Kennedy said, simply as if it were a small and not particularly important fact about himself, which in this moment it was. Raymond looked at the fountain. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at his own bare, split hands wrapped around it. He did not say anything for a long moment. I voted for you, he finally said. I know that does not mean anything right now. It means something, Kennedy said. It means something to me. He reached into the pocket of his overcoat and took out a small white card. He held it out to Raymond. That is a direct number, he said. Not a switchboard, not an operator, a direct line to a man named Harold Weaver in the Veterans Administration. He is expecting a call because I am going to call him myself when I go back inside, and I am going to tell him that a man named Raymond Curtis Elwood, who served with the 2nd Infantry Division along the 38th parallel in 1950 and 1951, is going to call him in the morning, and that Harold is to treat that call as if it came from me personally. Raymond looked at the card. He did not take it yet. There are programs, Kennedy said. Housing, assistance, re-entry support. They exist. They are funded. There are men whose entire job is to make sure that men like you know they exist. The problem is that nobody ever tells the men who need them where to find the door. You now know where the door is. Raymond took the card. He turned it over in his fingers. He looked at it for a long time. Why, he said finally, not as a challenge, as a genuine question from a man who had learned to ask why before he trusted anything. Because you earned it, Kennedy said. 14 years ago, you went somewhere cold and terrible because your country asked you to, and you did not come home to what you deserved. And that is not your failure. That is a failure. I sit inside that building and try to correct every single day, and tonight I am going to correct one small piece of it. Raymond nodded. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried. He pressed his lips together and nodded the way a man nods when something true has finally been said out loud after a very long time of it going unsaid. Kennedy stood. He buttoned the top button of his overcoat. He looked at Raymond on the bench. Keep the blanket, he said. It belongs to the United States government, which means it belongs to you as much as anyone. Then he walked back across the frozen path toward the East Garden entrance, and Thomas Burrell fell into step behind him, and the square was quiet again, except for the wind and the distant sound of the city. And Raymond Curtis Elwood sitting on a bench in Lafayette Square with a wool blanket around his shoulders and a small white card in his hand and a cup of coffee that was still warm.